The morning sun rose slowly over the dusty roofs of a small village of Amuaka, painting the red earth in soft golden light. Women arranged baskets of tomatoes and peppers in the market square, while children chased one another between wooden stalls. Life in the village moved with familiar rhythm, laughter, gossip, and the clatter of metal bowls. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and kindly hit the like button. It truly means a lot to us. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let's dive into this unforgettable story. But as the villagers laughed and bargained over food, another figure quietly walked along the narrow path toward the market. Her name was Nkem. Nkem kept her head lowered as she approached, clutching a small woven basket in her hands. Her dress was old and faded from years of washing, the seams patched carefully by her own hands. She moved carefully, almost cautiously, as though every step might invite trouble. Unfortunately, in Amuaka, it usually did. The moment she appeared near the market stalls, the whispers began. A group of young women selling palm oil leaned toward one another, covering their mouths as they giggled. "Look, the moon has come out in daylight," one of them mocked quietly. Another woman laughed harder. "No, the moon is beautiful. This one scares even the sun away." The cruel words floated through the warm morning air, light and careless, yet sharp enough to pierce straight into Nkem's heart. She pretended not to hear. For as long as she could remember, the village had given her many names. None of them were kind. Ugly girl, bush face, the mistake of nature. Even the children repeated the insults they heard from adults. Sometimes when she passed the village, they would run away dramatically, shouting and laughing as if she were some terrible creature. Nkem had learned long ago that defending herself only made the laughter louder. So she simply endured it. She moved quietly between the stalls, hoping to buy a few vegetables before returning home. But fate rarely allowed her such peace. Across the market square stood the one person who made her heart beat differently. Obinna. Tall, confident, and admired by nearly everyone in Amuaka, Obinna was the kind of man mothers proudly pointed out to their daughters. He was strong, handsome, and came from a respected family. Whenever he walked through the village, people greeted him warmly. And for years, Nkem had secretly loved him. It was a love she had never spoken aloud. Not to friends, not to neighbors, not even to herself. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. Girls like her were not meant to dream about men like Obinna. As Nkem quietly picked up a few tomatoes from a wooden tray, laughter suddenly erupted behind her. She froze. Obinna stood nearby with his friends, their voices loud and carefree. One of them nudged him playfully. "Tell us, Obinna, if the whole village disappeared and only one woman remained." The man paused dramatically. Then he pointed directly at Nkem. "Would you marry her?" The group burst into loud laughter. For a moment, Obinna did not speak. Nkem's heart pounded painfully inside her chest as she stood completely still, praying silently that he might say something kind. Instead, he shook his head with a careless smile. "I would rather marry a stranger," he said lightly, "than that girl." The laughter that followed echoed across the market like thunder. And in that moment, Nkem realized something heartbreaking. In Amuaka, her worth had already been decided, and no one intended to change it. Morning sunlight spilled over Amuaka village the next day, but for Nkem the world felt darker than the night before. The cruel laughter from the market still echoed inside her mind like a drum that refused to stop beating. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Obinna's voice again. "I would rather marry a stranger than that girl." The words had followed her home like a shadow. Still, life in the village never paused for anyone's heartbreak. By mid-morning, the sound of drums suddenly erupted across Amuaka. Loud talking drums echoed from the village square, their rhythm sharp and celebratory. Children ran excitedly down the dusty paths shouting the news. A wedding announcement. Obinna is getting married. Nkem, who had been sweeping the small compound in front of her house, froze instantly. The broom slipped slowly from her hand and dropped to the ground. Her chest tightened. She had always known this day would come. Men like Obinna did not remain unmarried for long. Mothers competed to present their daughters to him. Young women smiled sweetly whenever he passed. but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a knife quietly turning inside her heart. Curiosity, and something deeper she could not control, pulled her toward the village square. She walked slowly, keeping to the edge of the path so fewer people would notice her. But of course, people noticed. They always did. By the time she reached the square, a large crowd had already gathered. Colorful wrappers filled the open space, and elders sat proudly on wooden stools as the village drummer continued beating his talking drum. At the center stood Obinna. Beside him stood the woman who would become his wife, Adora. Adora was everything the village admired. Her skin glowed like polished bronze. Her smile was bright and confident. Even the way she stood carried elegance. Women whispered admiringly, while men nodded with approval. "They will make beautiful children," someone said proudly. Nkem felt her throat tighten. A group of young women nearby noticed her standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes lit up with cruel amusement. "Well, look who came," one said loudly. Another laughed. Maybe she thought she had a chance. The women burst into laughter, not bothering to lower their voices. Nkem stared at the ground, wishing the earth would swallow her. Suddenly, a firm voice cut through the noise. Obinna's mother had noticed her. The older woman stepped forward slowly, her expression sharp with disapproval. She looked Nkem up and down as though examining something unpleasant. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly. The crowd fell silent. Nkem opened her mouth, but no words came out. The woman shook her head in irritation. "Girls like you should stay hidden," she said firmly. "Today is a day for beauty and celebration, not embarrassment." The words landed harder than any slap. Quiet murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched with curiosity. Nkem's chest burned with humiliation. Across the square, Obinna glanced briefly in her direction. Their eyes met for only a second. Then he calmly looked away. The drummer resumed beating his drum, and the celebration continued as if nothing had happened. But for Nkem, something inside her had cracked open. And though no one in the village realized it yet, that crack would one day change everything in Amuaka forever. The wedding celebration in Amuaka grew louder as the afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky. Colorful wrappers swayed as women danced to the steady rhythm of the talking drums. Men clapped, children ran around laughing, and the entire village seemed wrapped in excitement. But standing quietly at the edge of the crowd was Nkem. Her heart pounded painfully inside her chest as she watched the celebration unfold. She knew she should leave. Every instinct told her that staying here would only bring more humiliation. Yet her feet refused to move. Part of her still held onto a fragile hope, a small, foolish hope, that maybe Obinna might look at her differently today. Maybe he might show even the smallest kindness. The drums suddenly stopped. An elder raised his hand, signaling the start of the formal introductions. One by one, villagers stepped forward to greet Obinna and Adora, offering gifts, prayers, and warm blessings for their future. The line slowly grew longer. Nkem watched people approach the couple, bowing respectfully before offering congratulations. Her heart whispered a dangerous thought. Maybe she could also step forward, not to confess her feelings, not to cause trouble, just to wish him well. Nothing more. Her hands trembled as she slowly stepped into the line. A few villagers glanced at her with surprise but said nothing. Soon she found herself moving closer and closer to the center of the gathering. But just before she could reach the couple, a loud voice interrupted. "Well, look who decided to join the celebration." One of Obinna's friends stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path. His smile carried the same cruel amusement she had seen many times before. Another man beside him laughed loudly. "Did someone invite you?" Several people nearby turned to watch. Nkem felt heat rush into her face. "I only came to congratulate," before she could finish speaking. The first man raised his hand dramatically. "Congratulate," he repeated with exaggerated surprise. He turned to the crowd. "Did everyone hear that?" She came to congratulate the groom. Laughter burst from several directions. Another friend leaned closer to Nkem, lowering his voice but making sure everyone could still hear. "Or maybe," he said slowly, "you came to beg him not to marry someone else." More laughter followed. Nkem's hands tightened around the small gift she had brought, a simple cloth she had spent weeks weaving. Her chest felt tight. She forced herself to look toward Obinna, hoping he might stop them. The groom stood only a few steps away. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, the noise of the crowd faded from Nkem's ears. This was the moment she had secretly imagined for years, the moment he might see her not as the village mockery, but as a human being. But Obinna simply looked at her. Then he looked away. He said nothing. His friends continued laughing. The crowd watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene. Nkem felt something inside her slowly collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet breaking deep within her chest. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away from the celebration. Behind her, the drums began playing again, and the village returned to its joyful noise. But as Nkem walked down the dusty road alone, one painful truth settled firmly in her heart. In Amuaka, she would never be anything more than a joke. Night slowly settled over Amuaka village, wrapping the quiet huts in soft darkness. The joyful noise of Obinna's wedding celebration had faded, leaving only the distant sound of crickets and rustling palm leaves in the cool evening air. But sleep did not come easily to Nkem. She sat alone near the narrow river that flowed quietly behind the village. The moon reflected on the water like a trembling mirror, and the soft current carried fallen leaves slowly downstream. Nkem hugged her knees tightly as she stared at the dark water. Her mind replayed the day again and again. The laughter, the mocking voices, Obinna's silence. Every moment felt sharper now that the village had grown quiet. For years she had endured the whispers and insults, telling herself that one day things might change. She had hoped that if she remained patient, if she stayed kind, if she worked hard and kept her head down, the village would eventually see her differently. But today had destroyed that hope completely. She could still hear Obinna's friend shouting, "Did you come to beg him not to marry someone else?" Nkem closed her eyes tightly as tears slipped down her cheeks. She felt small, invisible, like a mistake the world had forgotten to correct. The river continued moving gently beside her, uncaring and endless. For a brief moment, a dark thought crept quietly into her mind. What if she simply stepped into the water? What if she disappeared? The village would probably laugh for a few days. Then life would continue, as if she had never existed. The painful thought made her chest ache even more. But then another voice appeared inside her memory. Her mother's voice. Soft, calm, hopeful. "You are not meant to disappear in this village, my daughter," her mother had once told her years ago. "Your story is bigger than these dusty roads." Nkem slowly opened her eyes. Her mother had died long ago, but those words suddenly felt louder than the cruel voices of the village. "Your story is bigger than these dusty roads." She stared at the quiet river again. Maybe her mother had been right. Maybe the problem was not her. Maybe the problem was this place. The realization slowly settled into her heart like the first light of dawn. Without thinking further, Nkem stood up. Her decision came suddenly but felt strangely clear. She would leave. Tonight. Before the village could mock her again. Before her courage disappeared. Nkem walked back to the small hut she had shared with her mother. Inside, she packed the few things she owned into a worn cloth bag, 2 dresses, a pair of sandals, and the small woven cloth she had once planned to give Obinna. Then she stepped outside. The village slept peacefully under the moonlight, unaware that one of its daughters was about to vanish. Nkem walked quietly down the narrow path that led away from Amuaka. Step by step, the familiar huts and trees faded behind her. Her heart raced with fear, but she kept walking. Finally, she reached the lonely dirt road that connected the village to the outside world. Just as she paused, unsure which direction to take, headlights suddenly appeared in the darkness. A sleek black car rolled slowly toward her. It stopped beside her. The window lowered. Inside sat an elegant elderly woman with sharp, observant eyes. She studied Nkem for a long moment. Then she spoke calmly. "My child," the woman said, "why are you standing alone on this road at midnight?" Nkem hesitated, unsure how to answer. But before she could speak, the woman looked deeper into her face and smiled slightly. "Interesting," she murmured softly. Your eyes carry a story that the world has not discovered yet. The quiet road outside Amuaka felt strangely different now that Nkem stood beside the sleek black car. The headlights illuminated the dusty ground, casting long shadows across the empty road. For a moment, the world seemed to pause between two lives, the one she had just left behind and the unknown one waiting ahead. Nkem tightened her grip on the small cloth bag hanging from her shoulder. Her heart was still racing from the sudden appearance of the vehicle. The elegant elderly woman inside the car continued studying her carefully. My child, the woman repeated gently, why are you standing alone on this road at midnight? Nkem hesitated. No one had ever asked her that question with genuine concern before. Her voice came out quietly. I'm leaving the village. The woman raised an eyebrow slightly. Leaving? She asked. Nkem nodded slowly. There is nothing for me there anymore. The woman remained silent for a moment, her thoughtful eyes observing every detail of Nkem's face, the sadness, the exhaustion, and something deeper that even Nkem herself did not fully understand. Finally, the woman opened the car door. Come inside, she said calmly. Nkem hesitated again. She had grown up hearing warnings about strangers and danger on lonely roads. But something about the woman's voice felt different, steady, warm, and strangely reassuring. Slowly, Nkem stepped closer and sat inside the car. The interior smelled faintly of perfume and leather, a scent completely unfamiliar to her. The woman extended her hand politely. My name is Madam Ifyananya. Nkem blinked in surprise. Even someone from a small village like Amuaka had heard that name before. Madam Ifyananya was a respected entrepreneur known across the country for her fashion company and charitable work. You are Madam Ifyananya? Nkem asked softly. The woman smiled slightly. Yes. Nkem suddenly felt even more nervous. Madam Ifyananya leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms thoughtfully. So tell me, she said, what happened in that village that pushed you onto this road tonight? At first Nkem struggled to speak, but the quiet kindness in the woman's eyes slowly broke down the wall she had built around her pain. The story spilled out. She spoke about the mocking laughter, the cruel names, the humiliation in the market, and finally, the moment Obina turned away while everyone laughed. Madam Ifyananya listened without interrupting. When Nkem finally finished, silence filled the car. Then the older woman shook her head slowly. Villages can be very small places, she said thoughtfully. Small minds often live inside them. Nkem lowered her gaze again. They say I'm ugly, she whispered. Madam Ifyananya studied her face carefully. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke words that Nkem had never heard before in her entire life. You are not ugly, Madam Ifyananya said firmly. Nkem looked up in confusion. You are simply undiscovered. The words felt strange and unbelievable. Madam Ifyananya leaned forward slightly, her voice now filled with quiet certainty. I run a fashion company in the city, she explained. I train young women, teach them design, business, confidence. Some of them arrive with nothing. She paused. But the ones who succeed are the ones who survive pain. Her eyes softened. And your eyes carry the weight of someone who has survived. Nkem felt her heart tremble with a mixture of fear and hope. Madam Ifyananya opened the car door again. I am driving back to the city tonight, she said calmly. Then she asked the question that would quietly change Nkem's entire destiny. Tell me, child, would you like a chance to begin again? The city felt like another universe to Nkem. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, their glass windows reflecting sunlight so brightly it almost hurt her eyes. Cars moved endlessly along wide roads, their horns and engines creating a constant roar that never seemed to stop. Even the air smelled different, filled with perfume, gasoline, and something fast and restless. For someone who had spent her entire life in the quiet village of Amuaka, the city was overwhelming. But turning back was no longer an option. Madam Ifyananya's fashion studio stood inside a large white building on a busy street. When Nkem first walked through its glass doors, she felt as if every eye in the room instantly turned toward her. Young women moved around confidently, carrying fabrics, measuring tapes, and sketchbooks. Some stood in front of mirrors, adjusting dresses on elegant mannequins. They all looked polished, stylish, confident. Everything Nkem was not. Madame Ifeanyi clapped her hands once, gathering everyone's attention. "This is Nkem," she announced calmly. "She will be working with us from today." A few polite smiles appeared. But the moment Madame Ifeanyi walked away, the whispers began. "Where did she come from?" one girl muttered quietly. Another leaned closer to her friend. "She looks like she's never even seen a mirror before." Soft laughter followed. Nkem lowered her head, pretending to organize a pile of fabric while their words cut into her heart. The city, it seemed, had its own version of cruelty. But unlike the village, Nkem had something new now. A reason to endure. Her days quickly became long and exhausting. She woke before sunrise to clean the studio floors and arrange materials before the designers arrived. After that, she spent hours watching the experienced workers cut fabrics, sew designs, and sketch clothing patterns. Whenever she finished her assigned tasks, she quietly observed everything. Every stitch, every measurement, every idea. At night, after everyone had left, Nkem stayed behind with scraps of leftover fabric. Using dull pencils and old paper, she practiced drawing designs she imagined in her mind. Her hands trembled at first. Her lines were rough, but slowly they improved. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Some of the other workers still mocked her village background, but something unexpected was beginning to happen. Nkem was learning faster than anyone expected. One afternoon, nearly a year after she arrived, Madame Ifeanyi walked into the studio, holding a frustrated expression. "We have a problem," she announced. Everyone stopped working. "A major client rejected the new dress design for the fashion show," she explained. "They say it feels ordinary." The room fell silent. No one wanted to suggest a new idea and risk failing. But from a corner of the room, Nkem quietly stepped forward. Her hands shook as she held out a folded sheet of paper. I tried something last night," she said nervously. The room turned toward her in surprise. Madame Ifeanyi accepted the paper and unfolded it slowly. For several seconds she said nothing. Her eyes carefully studied the sketch. The design was bold yet elegant, a flowing dress that blended traditional African patterns with modern structure. The entire room waited. Finally, Madame Ifeanyi looked up. Her expression had completely changed. Instead of surprise, her eyes now carried something deeper. Pride. She held up the drawing for everyone to see. "Who taught you to design like this?" she asked. Nkem swallowed nervously. "No one," she answered softly. Madame Ifeanyi smiled slowly. "Interesting," she murmured. Then she spoke words that stunned the entire studio. "It appears," she said calmly, "we have been hiding a designer among cleaners." The studio had never felt so silent. Designers, assistants, and models all stared at the sketch Madame Ifeanyi held in her hands. Only the faint hum of the sewing machines filled the air as everyone waited for her next words. Nkem stood frozen where she was, her heart beating so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. She had never expected anyone to see that drawing. For months she had sketched quietly at night, hiding her papers before anyone arrived in the morning. Those drawings were never meant for display. They were simply the place where she poured her thoughts when the world around her felt too heavy. But now the entire studio was staring at one of them. Madame Ifeanyi slowly placed the sketch on the large cutting table. "Come here, Nkem," she said calmly. Nkem hesitated before stepping forward. The other workers watched her closely now. Their earlier amusement had disappeared, replaced by curiosity. Madame Ifeanyi pointed to the design. "Explain this part," she said. Nkem looked down at the paper nervously. "The waist structure holds the fabric like a crown," she explained quietly. "But the lower layers fall freely, so the person wearing it feels powerful. Not trapped." A murmur moved through the room. One designer leaned closer to examine the sketch. Another whispered to her colleague, clearly impressed. Madame Ifeanyi folded her arms thoughtfully. "You understand movement," she said slowly. "Most beginners only think about appearance." Nkem lowered her eyes. "I just imagine how people feel inside," she replied. For a moment, Madame Ifeanyi simply stared at her. Then she made a decision. "From today," she announced, her voice firm, "Nkem will begin training as a junior designer." The room erupted with surprised whispers. One of the older designers frowned slightly, but said nothing. Others exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to react. But Madame Ifeanyi's authority was unquestionable. The decision was final. For Nkem, life in the studio changed immediately. She was no longer cleaning floors or organizing fabrics all day. Instead, she spent hours studying design patterns, fabric structures, and fashion business strategies. The work was difficult. Very difficult. There were moments when she felt completely overwhelmed. Fashion terminology, measurements, and technical skills often left her confused. But every time frustration threatened to defeat her, she remembered the laughter of a Muoka village. And that memory pushed her forward. 2 years passed. The shy village girl slowly transformed into something new. Her confidence grew with each design she created. Clients began noticing the originality in her work. Fashion buyers from different cities started asking questions about the young designer working under Madame Ifeanyi. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. Madame Ifeanyi called Nkem into her office. The older woman looked unusually tired. Age had begun to show in her once energetic movements. "Nkem," she said gently, "you have grown faster than I expected." Nkem stood quietly, unsure where the conversation was going. Madame Ifeanyi opened a folder on her desk and slid a document across the table. "This company needs someone with new vision," she continued. Nkem looked down at the paper in confusion. Her eyes widened. It was a legal document transferring partial leadership of the company. To me?" Nkem asked in disbelief. Madame Ifeanyi nodded slowly. "My health is no longer strong enough to run everything," she explained calmly. She leaned forward slightly. "But talent like yours should not stay hidden behind my name." Nkem's hands trembled as she held the document. Her entire life had begun in a small village where people laughed at her face. And now someone was trusting her with an empire. Madame Ifeanyi smiled softly. "Great destinies," she said quietly, "often begin in the places where people least expect them." 5 years passed like a river moving quietly but powerfully toward the sea. In that time, Nkem's life changed in ways the girl from Muoka could never have imagined. The fashion company that once belonged to Madame Ifeanyi had grown far beyond the small studio where Nkem first learned to hold a pencil with confidence. What started as a modest business was now recognized across continents. Fashion magazines praised its originality. International buyers competed for its designs. Celebrities proudly wore its creations at global events. And at the center of it all stood Nkem. The same girl once mocked in a dusty village now walked confidently through glass offices and grand fashion halls. Designers from different countries waited nervously to present their ideas to her. Investors listened carefully whenever she spoke. Yet despite the wealth, the recognition, and the power she now possessed, something deep inside Nkem remained unchanged. The past still followed her like a quiet shadow. One evening, she stood alone inside her private office on the top floor of the company headquarters. Through the wide window, the city lights stretched endlessly into the night, glowing like thousands of tiny stars scattered across the earth. But Nkem's eyes were not focused on the city. They were focused on something much farther away. A memory, a Muoka village, the dusty roads, the laughter, the humiliation. Even after 5 years, those moments still lived inside her mind with painful clarity. The market square, Obinna turning away, his friends laughing. For years, Nkem had buried those memories beneath work, ambition, and success. She told herself the past no longer mattered. But tonight something felt different. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant stepped inside the office, carrying a stack of documents. "Madam Nkem," she said respectfully, "the investors from London have confirmed tomorrow's meeting." Nkem nodded slightly. "Leave the files on the desk," she replied. The assistant placed the papers down and hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Also, she added carefully, the International Fashion Summit in Paris has invited you as their keynote speaker. Another honor, another achievement, another sign that the world now respected the woman Amuaka once mocked. Yet strangely, the news did not excite her. After the assistant left, Nkem slowly walked back to the window. For several minutes, she simply stood there in silence. Then she spoke quietly to herself. "What is success?" she whispered softly. "If the past still holds your heart." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Suddenly, a realization formed in her mind, clear and unavoidable. Running away had given her freedom, but it had never given her closure. Her fingers slowly reached for the phone on her desk. Within minutes, her voice echoed calmly through the line. "Prepare the convoy," she instructed her driver. There was a brief pause on the other side. "Yes, madam," the driver replied. Nkem looked out at the distant horizon beyond the city lights. "I'm traveling tomorrow morning," she continued. "To where, madam?" the driver asked. Nkem's eyes softened slightly as the name rose from a place she had avoided for years. "Amuaka village," she said quietly. The line fell silent. Nkem placed the phone down gently. For the first time in 5 years, the girl who had once walked away in humiliation was finally ready to return. And this time, she would not return as the girl they mocked. She would return as something they never expected. A woman the world now called powerful. Morning arrived quietly over Amuaka village, just as it had for generations. The red earth roads were already alive with a familiar rhythm of village life. Women swept their compounds with long brooms made from palm fronds, raising soft clouds of dust into the golden sunrise. Children chased one another between huts, while farmers prepared to leave for their fields. For most villagers, the day looked perfectly ordinary. But before long, something unusual began to happen. A low rumbling sound slowly approached from the far end of the village road. At first, only a few people noticed it. They paused and turned their heads toward the dusty path that connected Amuaka to the outside world. The sound grew louder. Soon, a thick cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Children stopped playing. Women shaded their eyes with their hands. "Who is coming?" someone asked curiously. Within moments, the source of the noise finally became clear. A line of sleek black SUVs rolled slowly into the village. The vehicles looked completely out of place among the mud houses and narrow dirt paths. Their shiny bodies reflected the morning sun as they moved carefully over the uneven road. Villagers gathered quickly. Some stood at their doorways. Others walked closer to the road. No one in Amuaka had ever seen so many expensive vehicles enter the village at once. "Maybe government officials," one man suggested. Another shook his head. "Government cars don't look like that." The convoy continued forward until it reached the open space near the village square. Then the vehicle stopped. The engines fell silent. For a moment, the entire village held its breath. Doors opened. Several well-dressed security men stepped out first, scanning the surroundings calmly. Their presence alone was enough to make people step back respectfully. Then the back door of the central SUV opened slowly. A pair of elegant black heels touched the dusty ground. The crowd leaned closer. A tall woman stepped out of the vehicle with graceful confidence. She wore a flowing cream-colored outfit that moved gently in the morning breeze. Dark sunglasses covered her eyes, and her posture carried a quiet authority that commanded attention without effort. The villagers stared in silence. Whispers immediately spread through the crowd. "Who is she?" "Maybe a government minister." "She looks important." The woman removed her sunglasses slowly. Her eyes moved across the familiar village surroundings, the market stalls, the old mango tree, the dusty paths she once walked as a lonely girl. Memories rushed back like waves, but her expression remained calm. At the edge of the gathering, an elderly woman stepped closer, squinting carefully at the stranger's face. Something about her looked familiar, very familiar. The woman tilted her head. Then suddenly her eyes widened with shock. Her hand flew to her mouth. Impossible, she whispered. The word spread quickly through the crowd. What is it? Someone asked. The elderly woman pointed with a trembling finger. That face, she said slowly. More villagers leaned forward, studying the elegant stranger more carefully now. And then the realization began spreading from one person to another like fire catching dry grass. Gasps filled the air. It can't be. Is it really her? Finally, someone spoke the name that had once been the subject of endless village mockery. Nkem. The crowd fell completely silent. The once forgotten girl stood calmly before them, confident, radiant, powerful. The same village that once laughed at her now stared in disbelief. Because the girl they had called ugly had returned. And she had returned looking like a queen. The name moved through the crowd like a sudden wind. Nkem. The villagers stared at the elegant woman standing beside the black SUV, as if their eyes were struggling to believe what they were seeing. Only a few seconds earlier they had been whispering about a powerful stranger visiting their small village. Now the truth felt almost unbelievable. The shy girl they once mocked was standing before them again. But she was no longer the same person. Nkem stood calmly, her posture straight and confident. The morning sun reflected softly on her smooth skin, and the simple elegance of her outfit made her presence feel both graceful and powerful. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then, the whispers exploded. Is that really her? It cannot be the same Nkem. She looks completely different. Some villagers stepped closer, trying to compare the woman before them with the painful memory of the quiet girl who used to walk through the market with her head lowered. But the difference was undeniable. That girl had once carried shame. This woman carried authority. The village elder slowly approached her, leaning on his carved walking stick. His eyes studied her carefully before he finally spoke. My daughter, he said cautiously, are you truly Nkem? The daughter of late Mama Ijeoma. Nkem nodded gently. Yes, she replied calmly. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several women who had once laughed at her in the market now covered their mouths in disbelief. Others avoided her gaze completely, suddenly fascinated by the dusty ground beneath their feet. But the shock had not yet reached everyone. Across the square, a tall man stood frozen beside a wooden stall. Obina. He had arrived only moments earlier after hearing the unusual noise of expensive vehicles entering the village. At first he assumed some government officials were visiting, but now he stared at the woman in front of the crowd with wide, stunned eyes. He recognized her, not because of her clothes, not because of her confidence, but because of her eyes. The same quiet eyes he had once ignored, the same eyes that had watched him turn away in the market 5 years ago. His chest tightened as realization settled heavily inside him. The girl he once dismissed so easily had returned as someone far beyond his reach. Around him, villagers continued whispering. That is Nkem. The same Nkem we used to laugh at? How did this happen? The questions filled the air like restless birds. Meanwhile, the convoy drivers began unloading large boxes from the vehicles, stacking them neatly near the village square. More whispers followed. She must be very rich. Look at those cars. Even city leaders don't travel like this. Nkem remained calm, allowing the villagers to observe her transformation in silence. Then her gaze slowly moved across the crowd, and finally stopped on Obina. Their eyes met again, but this time the moment felt very different. 5 years earlier, he had looked away from her with indifference. Now he could not look away at all. Regret quietly filled his expression. He stepped forward slowly, almost as if pulled by an invisible force. The crowd noticed immediately and fell silent again. Everyone in Amuaka knew the painful history between them. The man who once rejected her now stood face to face with the woman she had become. Obina opened his mouth, searching for words that suddenly felt too small for the moment. Nkem, he began softly. But before he could continue, a voice behind him whispered something that made the moment even more tragic. Didn't you hear? His marriage ended last year. The revelation spread through the crowd quickly. The man who once chose beauty over her had lost everything. And now the woman he rejected stood before him as someone the entire village respected. A heavy silence settled over the village square as Obinna slowly walked toward Nkem. The villagers watched carefully, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Even the soft rustling of palm leaves seemed to fade as all attention focused on the two figures now standing face to face. 5 years earlier, the same village had watched a very different moment between them. Back then, Nkem had stood quietly with lowered eyes while laughter filled the air around her. Today, she stood tall, confident, unshaken. Obinna stopped a few steps in front of her. For a moment he struggled to find his voice. The confident young man the village once admired now looked uncertain, almost smaller somehow. "Nkem," he said again, his voice softer this time. She looked at him calmly. "Yes, Obinna." Hearing his name spoken without bitterness seemed to confuse him even more. He glanced briefly at the crowd surrounding them. Everyone was listening now, elders, traders, farmers, even children who did not fully understand the history unfolding before them. Obinna took a slow breath. I did not know it was you who returned," he said. Nkem did not respond. Her expression remained peaceful, giving away nothing. Obinna lowered his head slightly, the weight of old memories pressing heavily on his shoulders. "There are many things I wish I could change," he continued quietly. 5 years ago, I behaved like a foolish man." The villagers exchanged surprised glances. Many had never seen Obinna speak with such humility before. "I remember the market," he said slowly. "The day you came to congratulate me." His voice faltered slightly. "I should have stopped them. I should have said something." A few villagers shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own laughter that day. Obinna finally raised his eyes again. "I am sorry, Nkem." The apology hung in the air. It was sincere, but it arrived 5 years too late. For a long moment, Nkem simply looked at him. Inside her mind, memories flashed like distant lightning. The market square, the cruel laughter, the lonely walk out of the village that night. But strangely, the pain no longer felt sharp. It felt distant, like a scar that had already healed. Nkem smiled gently. The crowd leaned closer, eager to hear her response. "You do not need to apologize," she said calmly. Obinna looked confused. "But I hurt you," he insisted. "Yes," Nkem replied simply. Her honesty caused a quiet ripple through the crowd. Then she continued, "But pain can also be a teacher." The villagers listened carefully now. "If that moment had not happened," she said softly, "I might never have left this village." She gestured lightly toward the convoy of vehicles behind her. "I might never have discovered who I was meant to become." Obinna stared at her in silence. The bitterness he expected was not there. Instead, there was something stronger. Peace. Nkem's voice remained calm as she added one final sentence. "The girl you rejected no longer exists." A few villagers gasped quietly, but before the words could sound cruel, she continued. "She grew into someone new." Obinna lowered his gaze again, understanding the truth behind her words. The opportunity he once ignored could never return. Not because Nkem held anger, but because she had already grown beyond the past. Around them, the villagers stood quietly, absorbing a powerful lesson without anyone needing to say it aloud. True strength was not revenge. It was becoming someone the past could no longer control. The village square remained quiet long after Nkem finished speaking to Obinna. Her calm words seemed to settle over the crowd like a gentle wind, leaving many villagers lost in their own thoughts. Some stared at the ground in shame, remembering the cruel laughter they once shared. Others watched her with new respect, realizing the girl they once mocked had grown into someone far greater than they ever imagined. Nkem slowly turned her gaze away from Obinna and looked across the village square. The place had barely changed. The old mango tree still stood at the center, its wide branches casting shade over the dusty ground. The same wooden stalls surrounded the market. Even the narrow paths between houses looked exactly as they had 5 years ago. Only one thing was different: her place in this village. The drivers behind her continued unloading boxes from the vehicles. Villagers watched curiously as the packages were arranged neatly in the open square. The village elder stepped closer again, leaning on his carved staff. "My daughter," he said respectfully, "we do not understand why someone as successful as you would return here." Several villagers nodded quietly. After everything this village had done to her, no one expected kindness from her. Nkem looked around slowly before answering. "When I left Amuoka 5 years ago," she began calmly, "I carried pain in my heart." The crowd listened carefully. "I believed this village had rejected me completely." Her voice remained steady. "But as the years passed, I began to understand something important." She paused briefly. "A place does not become better when people run away from it." Some villagers shifted uncomfortably. "It becomes better when someone returns with the courage to change it." The words moved through the crowd like a quiet revelation. Nkem gestured toward the stacked boxes. "These supplies are for building new classrooms in the village school," she explained. Gasps of surprise spread through the villagers. She continued, "And next month construction will begin on a training center where young people can learn skills, fashion design, business, and crafts." More shocked whispers followed. "No child in this village should grow up believing their dreams are impossible," she said gently. Tears filled the eyes of several women standing nearby. Nkem then looked toward the dusty road that had once carried her away in heartbreak. "I left this village as someone who believed she had no value," she said quietly. Her voice softened but remained strong. "But the world showed me something different." She turned back to face the crowd. "And now I have returned to show the same truth to all of you." The elder nodded slowly, deeply moved. "You have returned not only as a successful woman," he said. He raised his voice so the entire village could hear. "You have returned as a queen." The word spread through the crowd like a blessing. Queen. But Nkem simply smiled gently, because deep down she understood something greater. True greatness was not about wealth or power. It was about transformation. The girl they once mocked had not disappeared. She had simply walked a longer road. And on that road she discovered her strength, her purpose, and her destiny. As the villagers gathered around the new supplies with excitement and gratitude, Nkem looked once more at the village she had left behind years ago. This time, she did not feel pain, only peace. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all. It is becoming the person no one believed you could be.